Irene Brooks had learned a long time ago that rich people rarely whispered when they wanted someone poor to feel small. They preferred polished smiles, lifted brows, and comments delivered loudly enough for a table to enjoy. So when a guest at the Harrington Foundation Gala pointed at Irene's worn black shoes and asked, "Did those come with the uniform?" Irene did not answer. She only balanced the silver tray, offered champagne to the next hand, and moved on before the laughter could settle on her shoulders. The ballroom glittered as if kindness itself had been dipped in money. Chandeliers shone above designer gowns, velvet chairs, white roses, and 3 enormous screens showing live donations for a charity fund everyone claimed to love. Every few minutes, the room applauded another pledge. 50,000. 100,000. 500,000. Cameras turned toward donors with practiced admiration. The people at the tables spoke about dignity, opportunity, and service, while Irene slipped between them carrying glasses they emptied without looking at her face. But Irene's eyes were not on the diamonds. They were not on the cameras, the speeches, or the giant ceremonial check waiting beside the stage. Her eyes were on the numbers. A receipt code repeated in 2 different donor accounts. A silent auction package was listed under one beneficiary in the printed program and another on the screen. A transfer form near the registration desk carried the name of a private consulting company that sounded almost exactly like the charity it was supposed to support. Her hands went cold around the tray. 3 years earlier, Irene had been a nonprofit auditor, the kind of woman who could follow a misplaced dollar through 6 polite lies and find the person hiding behind them. She had lost that career after refusing to sign a report she knew was false. Powerful people called her difficult. Her supervisor called her careless. By the end of that year, her name had become a warning whispered in offices where she used to be respected. She had promised herself she would never touch another charity ledger again. Yet here she was, in borrowed catering clothes, watching the same pattern unfold in front of 200 wealthy guests in New York. Only this time, the lies were not buried in a file cabinet. They were glowing on screens taller than she was. A woman at table 6 laughed at Irene's shoes again. An event manager told her to keep moving. The foundation director stepped onto the stage and smiled like a saint. Everyone in the room saw a waitress who needed the job too badly to speak. No one knew she could read every lie on the screen. The first laugh did not surprise her. The second one did. It came from a man who had just praised second chances in a filmed interview near the entrance. Irene recognized his voice because she had held the microphone cable while he said every person deserved a path back to meaningful work. Now he was laughing at a waitress because her shoes looked tired. She placed a glass beside him and wondered how many people in the room would still believe in dignity if no camera was pointed at them. The charity's promotional video began again on the side screens. Adults sat at computers, practiced interviews, studied bookkeeping, and smiled as if the future had finally opened a small door. Irene wanted to believe in that door. She needed to believe in it. Once, she had been the person who checked whether donations actually reached programs like those. She knew the difference between a restricted fund and a marketing phrase. She knew how one altered word could move money away from a classroom and into a consulting account with polished stationery. That was why the repeated code disturbed her so deeply. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of clue anyone at table 6 would notice between champagne and applause. It was small, almost boring, exactly the sort of detail dishonest people trusted honest people to ignore. Irene saw the screen change, then saw the printed program disagree with it. She felt the past step closer, the conference room, the report, the supervisor who told her to sign first and ask questions later. The Coldway invitation stopped after she refused. A waiter brushed past her and whispered that table 6 wanted more champagne. Irene nodded, but her eyes remained on the registration desk. Someone had just replaced a stack of pledge forms. Someone else slipped the older stack into a black portfolio. Julian Marlowe was still smiling near the stage, but for 1 second, when he looked toward the desk, his smile sharpened into instruction. Irene knew then that the night was not built on one mistake. It was built on timing. Applause first, photographs second, transfers third. Questions never. She looked down at her shoes, the same shoes everyone thought proved she had no place in the room. The cracked leather reflected a sliver of chandelier light. She had worn better shoes in her old life, but none had carried her to a choice this clear. If she stayed silent, she would keep her shift and lose something quieter. If she spoke, she might lose the small safety she had left. The guests saw a waitress. The numbers saw an auditor. And before the final check reached the stage, Irene Brooks would have to decide which woman she was willing to be. The final pledge was minutes away. Irene felt the room leaning toward its happy ending, ready for photographs, applause, and a number large enough to bury questions. She had spent years teaching herself that survival meant leaving powerful people alone. Yet the screen kept changing, and the names pointed toward the same polite theft that had ruined her old career. Her shoes hurt. Her hands shook. Still, the tray in her grip became steady. Silence was no longer safe before anyone applauded tonight. By 7:15 that evening, Irene Brooks had already polished her shoes twice. Not because they looked good. They did not. The black flats were old, softened at the sides, and creased near the toes from years of standing through hotel brunches, corporate breakfasts, private dinners, and catering shifts where no one remembered the names of the people carrying the trays. The soles were thin enough that she could feel the cold floor of the service entrance beneath her feet. One buckle had lost its shine. The left heel made a faint clicking sound whenever she walked too quickly. Still, she rubbed them with a folded napkin in the staff changing room until the leather caught a little light. It was not vanity. It was discipline. Her mother used to say that if the world insisted on looking down, it should at least see that she had tried. Irene had lived by that rule in offices, in court-like conference rooms, in temporary agencies, and now in the back corridors of banquet halls. She smoothed the front of her borrowed white shirt, adjusted the black vest that was half an inch too tight around her ribs, and tied her hair into a low bun. The catering company had given her a name tag with only her first name printed on it. Irene, no last name. No title, no history. For this kind of room, that was all they wanted from her. Outside the changing room, the service hallway buzzed with controlled panic. Staff members moved in narrow lines carrying champagne flutes, folded linens, silver domes, boxes of auction paddles, and trays of tiny desserts arranged like jewelry. Somewhere beyond the walls, soft music flowed through hidden speakers. It was the kind of music rich people chose when they wanted generosity to feel expensive. The Harrington Foundation Gala was being held in the Ashford Grand Ballroom, a New York venue built to make wealth look older, calmer, and more noble than it was. Marble stairs curved toward a mezzanine, gold railings gleamed under warm lights. The ceiling had painted clouds that never moved. Irene had worked rooms like this before. She knew the rhythm. Guests arrived wrapped in perfume, wool, silk, and confidence. They handed coats to attendants without looking at their faces. They accepted drinks before checking who offered them. They spoke of purpose, legacy, impact, and community, while stepping around the people hired to collect their empty glasses. Tonight, every camera in the ballroom was pointed toward kindness. At the far end of the room, 3 giant screens displayed the Harrington Foundation logo, a silver tree with open branches. Beneath it, a slogan glowed in blue letters: "Building dignity through opportunity." Dignity. Irene paused when she saw that word. It followed rich people everywhere at events like this. It was printed on banners, spoken from stages, placed in donor packets, and repeated by publicists until it sounded like proof. But Irene had learned that dignity was not proven by what someone said into a microphone. It was proven by how they treated the woman standing beside the wall with a tray in her hands. That lesson had cost her more than one job. It had also kept her from becoming the kind of person who could smile while signing a lie. A sharp voice called the staff briefing to order. Thomas Greer, the event manager, stood near the service entrance with a tablet in one hand and a headset hooked over one ear. He was tall, narrow, and polished in a way that made him look permanently annoyed by hourly wages. He reminded the servers that the guests were major donors, board members, sponsors, and press contacts. They were not to start conversations. They were not to linger. They were not to comment on bids, donations, clothing, politics, or anything overheard. If they saw something unusual, they were to come to him quietly and do nothing else. His eyes passed over the line of servers and stopped briefly on Irene's shoes. Only briefly. But Irene saw it. People who judged for a living never needed long. Thomas continued speaking about discretion, timing, and the importance of protecting the guest experience. A younger server beside Irene swallowed nervously. Irene kept her expression still. She understood rules. She had lived under rules her entire working life. Rules for offices, rules for audits, rules for signatures, rules for silence, Rules that protected institutions first and people second. Tonight, she needed the paycheck. That was the rule that mattered. Rent was due in 9 days. Her phone bill had already been extended once. The temp agency had not called back about the office assistant position. A neighbor had offered to fix Irene's kitchen sink, but Irene was too proud to accept help she could not repay. So she took the tray when it was handed to her. She stepped through the service door. The ballroom swallowed her whole. Light hit first, then sound. The room shimmered with crystal, satin, camera flashes, and laughter low enough to sound civilized. Round tables filled the center of the ballroom, each dressed in ivory linen and silver chargers. On stage stood a podium beside an oversized ceremonial check with blank spaces waiting for the final amount. Near the west wall, a silent auction display stretched across several tables. There were private chef experiences, art pieces, signed first editions, spa weekends, wine tastings, investment retreats, and a certificate for a leadership weekend priced higher than Irene's yearly rent. The guests looked expensive in ways that did not announce themselves loudly. Tailored jackets, soft watches, shoes that made no sound because they had never touched bad pavement. Women with diamonds at their ears, and men who checked their phones as if each message might move a market. Irene moved between them with champagne, speaking softly, offering glasses, and accepting invisibility as the price of the shift. She had almost reached table 6 when a woman in a silver dress turned her head and looked down, not at the tray, at Irene's feet. The woman's mouth curved. She asked if those shoes had come with the uniform. A small silence opened, followed by laughter. Not loud enough to embarrass the people laughing, only loud enough to embarrass Irene. A man beside the woman called the shoes vintage. The woman answered that they were more like tragic. Irene held the tray steady. She did not look at her shoes. She did not look at their faces. She asked if the man wanted champagne. He took one glass and called her a good girl before turning away. Something inside Irene tightened. It was not anger exactly. Anger required room. Anger required the belief that your reaction mattered. What she felt was older than anger, a familiar folding inward, the private humiliation of needing money badly enough to stand still while strangers enjoyed making her smaller. She moved to the next table. Behind her, Beatrice Vane's laugh floated into the music. Irene knew the name because it had been printed on the seating chart in the service hallway. Beatrice Vane, gala co-chair, major donor, real estate investor, table 6. At the next table, a man explained to his companion that poverty was mostly a mindset problem. He took champagne from Irene's tray, without pausing his sentence. Opportunity was everywhere, he said. People simply failed to recognize it. Irene almost smiled at that. Opportunity, in her experience, often wore a locked door and asked for 3 references. She moved on. By 8 o'clock, the gala had settled into its performance. Guests were seated. The first course had been served. The foundation video played across the screens. Adults in classrooms, workers learning computer skills, community centers with fresh paint, people shaking hands in slow motion. The voiceover spoke about second chances, workforce dignity, and rebuilding lives through training. Irene stood near the wall with 2 other servers, waiting for the signal to clear plates. For a moment, despite herself, she listened. The program sounded good. Adult training, job placement, financial literacy, certification courses, help for people who had been left behind by industries that moved too fast and cared too little. People like the woman Irene had become. Then, the first donation number appeared on the screen. $50,000 from Vane Holdings. Applause rose. Beatrice lifted one hand gracefully from table 6, accepting gratitude from the air. Another pledge flashed, then another, then another. Irene's eyes followed the numbers automatically. She did not mean to. For 3 years, she had trained herself not to care about donor codes, pledge forms, allocation lines, restricted funds, reporting categories, or the quiet language of nonprofit money. She had promised herself that she was done with ledgers, compliance files, and rooms where powerful people smiled while asking her to certify things she knew were not true. But old training does not leave the body because a job title disappears. A mechanic hears an engine. A pianist hears a wrong note. A former auditor sees a number that appears twice. Irene blinked. On the lower corner of the screen, beside the pledge ticker, every donation carried a receipt code: HV1042, HV1043, HV1044. Then the next pledge appeared from a private donor with the receipt code HV1042 again. That could have been a display error, a duplicated visual field, a software delay, a harmless mistake from the production team. She told herself that. Then a silent auction item appeared on the side screen, a Hudson Valley Culinary Weekend, beneficiary Harrington Community Housing Partners. Irene looked at the printed program lying on a nearby service station. The same item was listed there, but the beneficiary name was different. Harrington Community Housing Fund. Fund on paper. Partners on the screen. One small word, slipped into the middle of generosity where no one with champagne in hand would look twice. Irene's fingers tightened around the empty tray. Her heartbeat changed, not faster at first, lower, heavier. She turned slightly and scanned the room. On stage, the master of ceremonies smiled. Near the registration desk, two foundation staffers arranged pledge envelopes. Beside them sat transfer forms clipped with silver binder clips. One form lay crooked, half visible beneath a folder. Irene should have looked away. Instead, she saw the name printed near the bottom. Harrington Outreach Consulting, LLC. Her breath stopped, not because she knew that exact company, but because she knew the shape of it, a real charity name softened into a private entity, a donor fund redirected through a consulting label, a phrase broad enough to sound legitimate and vague enough to hide almost anything. She had seen that pattern before, 3 years earlier, before the borrowed uniform, before catering shifts, before her name became something temp agencies said carefully before explaining that the position had been filled. Thomas appeared beside her and asked why she was standing still. Irene lowered her gaze and said she was waiting for clearance to collect plates. He told her to wait without staring at the donor screen, because guests noticed when staff looked confused. She answered before she could stop herself. She said she was not confused. Thomas's expression cooled. He stepped closer and advised her not to make herself interesting. Then he walked away. Irene stood with the tray pressed lightly against her waist. Do not make yourself interesting. She had spent 3 years trying to do exactly that, trying to be forgettable, safe, and useful, in rooms where no one asked why a woman who understood audit trails was serving dessert. A burst of applause filled the ballroom as another pledge appeared, $500,000 from the Marlowe Family Trust. The name made Irene look up. On stage, a man in a dark tuxedo walked to the podium. Silver hair, warm smile, calm hands. The room welcomed him before he spoke, as if his reputation had entered ahead of him. The master of ceremonies introduced him as Julian Marlowe, executive director of the Harrington Foundation. Irene knew that name. Not from television, not from newspapers, from a file she had tried very hard to forget. Her fingers went cold around the tray. Julian smiled out at the room and began speaking about trust, service, and the moral responsibility of privilege. Everyone listened. Everyone believed they were hearing a good man. Irene, standing near the wall in her worn shoes, looked from Julian to the donation screen, then down at the transfer form near the registration desk. Humiliation was no longer the thing she felt most. Fear had taken its place. The numbers were not wrong by accident. The man asking the room to trust him had once stood very close to the lie that ended the life she had built for herself. Julian's speech was elegant enough to make suspicion feel rude. He spoke about the dignity of work, the courage of adults who return to classrooms after long days, and the responsibility of donors to stand beside people who wanted another chance. Each phrase was perfectly shaped, each pause invited applause. Irene hated how good he was at sounding sincere. She remembered the first time she had read his name on a routing memo 3 years ago, printed beside a consulting recommendation that made no sense. Back then, she had been told not to worry about it. Important people had already reviewed the structure. Her job was only to confirm the totals. Her job had never been only totals. That was what her supervisor never understood, or pretended not to understand. Money carried intention. A restricted grant was a promise. A donor pledge was not just a number, it was a direction. If the money changed direction, the promise changed with it. Irene had built her old career on respecting that promise. She had been proud of it, though pride now felt like a luxury from another woman's closet. She could still remember her desk, her 2 screens, the blue mug with a chipped handle, and the quiet satisfaction of finding one clean answer hidden under messy data. She could also remember the meeting where everything tilted. Her supervisor, Carl Denton, had placed a report in front of her and asked for her signature before noon. The report said a community advancement fund had spent its money properly. Irene's test sample said otherwise. Payments had moved through a consulting company with an address shared by a private advisory group. Deliverables were described with soft phrases that could mean anything: leadership alignment, stakeholder mapping, community readiness. None of those words built classrooms, trained workers, or paid instructors. Irene refused to sign. Carl smiled as if she were being dramatic. He told her that idealism was charming in entry-level staff and exhausting in adults. Irene was not entry-level. She had spent 10 years learning how polite documents concealed ugly decisions. She asked for another week. Carl said the donors were waiting. She asked for supporting invoices. Carl said the board had already reviewed them. She asked why Julian Marlowe's name appeared in a side agreement. Carl's smile disappeared. By the end of that month, Irene was described as uncooperative. By the end of the next, she was described as careless. The official story did not accuse her of anything large. It did something worse. It made her sound unreliable in small, reasonable ways. Missed deadline, poor judgment, breakdown in communication. No one needed to prove that she had lied. They only needed to make hiring her feel inconvenient. Invitations stopped, references cooled. Former colleagues answered emails with careful distance. The nonprofit world spoke the language of compassion, but it protected its donors with steel doors. Irene went from auditing grants to formatting resumes for strangers, then to temp reception work, then to seasonal retail, then to catering. Every step down came with someone telling her it was temporary. Eventually, temporary became a life. She stopped reading annual reports. She stopped attending webinars. She put her old business cards in a drawer under winter scarves and tried not to open it. Now Julian Marlowe stood beneath a chandelier and said transparency was the foundation of trust. Irene almost laughed, but there was no humor in her. A server behind her whispered that Julian looked like the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday. Irene thought he looked like the kind of man who remembered what could be used against them. When his speech ended, applause filled the room. Guests rose halfway from their chairs. Beatrice Vane pressed a hand to her necklace and smiled with admiration. Thomas Greer clapped with the relieved energy of a man whose schedule was still intact. The dinner service resumed. Irene carried plates of roasted vegetables and small portions of fish, arranged with sauce dots too artistic to satisfy anyone hungry. She kept her face calm, but her mind worked behind her eyes. One repeated receipt code, one altered beneficiary, one consulting company, one name from the past. Any single mistake could be harmless. Together, they formed a line. Not proof yet, but direction. She needed more. The idea frightened her so much that she almost turned toward the service door and left. She could walk out, lose the shift, and protect the fragile quiet she had built around herself. No one would know what she had seen. Then she heard two guests laughing about how emotional the foundation video had been. One said it was nice that someone was teaching forgotten workers how to be useful again. Forgotten workers. Irene placed their plates down carefully. She wondered whether either of them would recognize a forgotten worker if she stood close enough to pour their wine. The thought steadied her. She did not need to save the world tonight. She did not even need to win. But if someone was using a fund for adult training as a cover, then the money being redirected belonged to people who knew what it meant to start again with sore feet and a closed door. At table 12, a guest dropped a bid sheet. It slid under the tablecloth and landed near Irene's shoe. She bent to retrieve it. The paper had been folded once, then unfolded, leaving a crease through the item description. The printed text named a luxury retreat package, but the line for beneficiary read Harrington Outreach Consulting. Not housing fund. Not even housing partners. Consulting. Irene straightened and returned the sheet to the guest, who accepted it without thanks. But in the second before it left her hand, she saw a donor identification number that matched the duplicated code from the screen. Her throat tightened. She carried an empty tray back to the service station and reached for the printed program again. She did not take it. She only opened it as if checking the dinner timing. The program listed each auction package with the public beneficiary. Housing Fund appeared 3 times. Workforce Fund appeared twice. Community Training Fund appeared under the Leadership Retreat. On the screen, those same items now rotated under names that sounded similar but were not identical. Partners, Outreach, Advisory, Consulting. Each name could be defended as an affiliate. Each could pass in a room where people cared more about applause than paperwork. Irene knew the trick. Fraud did not need a mask if it could wear a name tag almost identical to the truth. She found Thomas near the curtain leading to the registration desk. He was speaking into his headset, telling someone that the stage transition had to happen at 9:30 sharp. Irene waited until he lowered his hand. She said his name quietly. He looked at her as if she had spilled something. She told him there might be an error in the beneficiary names on the pledge screen. He glanced toward the ballroom and asked what she meant by error. She explained that the printed program and the screen did not match. She mentioned the repeated receipt code. She kept her tone calm, practical, almost apologetic. She did not mention Julian. Thomas stared at her for a long second, then asked why she was reading pledge screens. Irene said the discrepancies were visible from the service station. He told her the production team handled screens and the foundation handled donor records. The catering staff handled food and beverage. Irene said she understood, but the names on the forms might affect where the money went. Thomas's face hardened at the word money. He asked if she was accusing the foundation of something. Irene said no. She was reporting a possible issue before it became embarrassing. Thomas leaned closer and told her the only embarrassing issue he saw was a server who did not know the boundary between service and interference. The rebuke landed exactly where he intended. Irene felt the old heat rise in her face. People did not need to shout to make someone feel out of place. Thomas told her to return to the floor, avoid table 6 unless assigned, and leave documents to professionals. The word professionals almost made Irene speak again. She swallowed it. A professional, she had learned, was often just a person with permission to be believed. She returned to the ballroom. The screens glowed above the guests. Another pledge appeared. Another round of applause. The repeated code was gone now, replaced by a clean sequence. That did not comfort her. It worried her more. Errors fixed themselves visibly only when someone noticed they had been seen. Irene began watching the room differently. Thomas moved between service, registration, and backstage with too much urgency. A foundation assistant replaced one stack of pledge forms with another. The technician near the screen laptop checked his phone, then clicked through a file folder twice. Julian Marlowe stood beside Beatrice Vane and laughed as if the night were unfolding perfectly. Perhaps it was. For him, Irene's old instincts returned in layers. Do not chase everything. Follow what changes. Do not assume the largest number matters most. Find the document someone is most eager to replace. A tray of desserts arrived from the kitchen, and Irene was assigned to table 6. She approached Beatrice with small plates of lemon tart and chocolate mousse. Beatrice looked at the desserts, then at Irene's shoes, and sighed as if forced to witness poverty during dessert. She asked whether Irene had considered using part of her tip money for footwear. The table laughed again. Irene placed the plates down, one by one. A drop of berry sauce slid from the edge of a plate and landed near the toe of her left shoe. Beatrice tilted her head and said the shoe had finally found color. Irene felt the room narrow. Then she saw the folded pledge card beside Beatrice's water glass. The signature on the pledge card was thick and theatrical, the kind donors used when they expected photographs. Beneath it, faintly visible through the paper because of the lighting, was another signature line from a carbon copy beneath. It was not identical, but it was close enough to be copied by someone who had practiced. Irene did not touch it. She only looked long enough to know that Beatrice's pledge had likely been pre-filled before she signed it. That was not illegal by itself. Busy donors let assistants prepare forms all the time. But the beneficiary line was blank. A blank beneficiary under a public pledge was a doorway. Someone could fill it later, quietly, after applause had already done its work. Irene walked away with the dessert tray and made herself breathe. Her feet hurt. The left heel clicked. The humiliation that had filled her earlier was changing shape. It was becoming clarity. Beatrice thought the shoes proved Irene did not belong in the room. Thomas thought the uniform proved she had no right to speak. Julian thought old damage would keep her quiet. Every insult lowered the room's guard around her. People left papers near her because they did not imagine she could read them. They discussed transfers while she poured coffee because they believed service made her deaf. They were wrong, and their wrongness was becoming her only advantage. In the service corridor, she found a discard bin beside the temporary registration desk. Most of it held napkins, tape backing, torn name badges, and draft seating charts. On top lay a crumpled half-sheet with a table of item numbers. Irene should not have taken it. She knew the line between observation and possession. She also knew that lines were often drawn to keep inconvenient people from proving what convenient people did. She lifted the sheet, smoothed it against the tray, and read quickly. 4 auction items had arrows pointing from public funds to consulting entities. One initials mark appeared beside the changes. J.M. Julian Marlowe. Before she could fold the paper, a voice behind her said her name. Not Irene from her name tag. Irene Brooks. The full name struck harder than a hand on her shoulder would have. She turned. Julian Marlowe stood 3 feet away, smiling with no warmth in his eyes. Up close, he looked even more controlled than he had on stage. He asked whether she had found something confusing. Irene slid the paper beneath the tray cloth without looking down. She said she was clearing the service area. Julian looked at the tray, then at her face. He said it had been a long time since he had seen her name on a staff list. Irene did not ask how he knew her. She already understood. Men like Julian collected information the way other people collected art. He said the evening was important for many deserving programs, and that misunderstandings could harm the very people Irene presumably cared about. His tone was gentle enough to sound like concern if anyone overheard. She said she had noticed discrepancies. He smiled more broadly. Discrepancies, he repeated, as if the word amused him. Then he said that someone with her professional history should be careful about making claims in a room full of lawyers and donors. The words were soft, but the meaning was exact. He knew the file. He knew the old allegations. He knew which scar to press. Thomas appeared beside Julian, looking annoyed and satisfied at the same time. Julian told Thomas that Irene seemed tired and might need to be reassigned away from documents. Thomas said he would handle it. Julian gave Irene one last smile and returned to the ballroom. Thomas waited until Julian was out of earshot before telling Irene that she was one complaint away from being removed. He said the catering company would hear that she had been hovering near donor materials, and he doubted anyone would hire a server with that note in her record. Irene looked at him. She wanted to say that records could lie. Instead, she said nothing. Silence had become both her shield and her prison. Thomas sent her to the kitchen for coffee service. The kitchen was bright, hot, and brutally honest compared with the ballroom. No one pretended compassion lived in the garnish station. Cooks shouted times. Dishwashers moved racks. Servers counted cups. Irene stood near the coffee urns and pressed one hand against the edge of the stainless steel table. For a moment, she wanted to put the tray down, untie the apron, and leave through the freight elevator. Julian had been right about one thing. She had very little. A rented room. A phone plan. A few shifts. A reputation already damaged once. If she challenged him, he could make losing all of that look like her fault. She remembered the months after the old report. She remembered refreshing her email until midnight, waiting for interview responses that never came. She remembered a former colleague lowering her voice in a cafe and saying she believed Irene privately but could not be associated with the mess. She remembered selling a good coat because winter had ended and rent had not. She remembered taking her first catering shift and telling herself it was temporary. What frightened her now was not simply losing work, it was being made unbelievable again. Some punishments did not remove your voice, they taught rooms not to hear it. A woman entered the kitchen carrying a folder against her chest. She was not staff. Her dress was simple, and her badge identified her as Lila Moreno, Program Director for the East River Adult Skills Center. Irene recognized the center from the foundation video. Lila looked overwhelmed, grateful, and slightly out of place among the caterers. She asked whether someone knew where she should wait before the final check presentation. The kitchen captain pointed her toward the wrong hall. Irene corrected him before she could think better of it. Lila thanked her with the kind of direct eye contact guests rarely offered. For a second, Irene felt seen in a way that made her uneasy. Lila explained, almost to herself, that tonight's funding would allow her center to open evening classes for workers who could not attend during the day. Bookkeeping, computer skills, administrative training, interview preparation. Adults who had spent years in service jobs, warehouses, kitchens, and reception desks would get a chance to move into steadier work. She smiled and said the grant could change the next 5 years for hundreds of people. Irene listened. The words did not sound like stage language from a donor packet. They sounded specific, practical, and tired in the way real work sounded tired. Lila was not buying applause. She was waiting for funds she had planned around. That was the moment Irene understood what silence would cost. It would not cost Julian anything. It would not cost Beatrice anything. It would not even cost Thomas much. The people who paid would be the ones sitting in evening classrooms after long shifts, hoping a certificate might open a door. People with sore feet, overdue bills, and names printed too small on someone else's schedule. People like her. The thought settled heavier than fear. She could leave and protect herself. Or she could stay long enough to make the lie harder to complete. She did not know whether she could stop it. She only knew she could no longer pretend she had not seen it. She asked Lila, carefully, what the legal name of the receiving fund was. Lila answered without hesitation. Harrington Community Training Fund, restricted grant account, no affiliates authorized for direct receipt. Irene asked whether Harrington Outreach Consulting handled any programming. Lila frowned. She had never heard of it. Irene thanked her and said nothing else. Lila studied Irene's face, perhaps sensing more than Irene wanted to reveal, but she did not press. When Lila left for the stage corridor, Irene stood a moment longer beside the coffee urn. Her decision did not feel brave. It felt like stepping into cold water because the bridge behind her had already disappeared. She returned to the ballroom with coffee service and began gathering proof the only way she could. She did not have office access. She did not have authority. She did not have a badge that opened donor files. But she had a server's invisibility, and invisibility had its own doors. She could move between tables. She could refill cups near open folders. She could collect abandoned programs. She could see screens from angles, guests ignored. She could hear staff instructions because no one lowered their voices around a waitress. She took mental snapshots first. Then, when no one watched, she used her old phone to photograph the pledge board as it rotated. The phone's cracked screen made the task humiliatingly difficult. It lagged when she opened the camera. The storage warning appeared twice. She deleted 3 old grocery list photos and tried again. She captured the screen showing housing partners. She captured another showing outreach consulting. She photographed the printed program at the service station, then the discarded draft sheet in her apron pocket. Each small image felt fragile, insufficient, and necessary. An auditor builds a case with what the room gives her, she reminded herself. She used to tell junior staff that proof was not a lightning strike. Proof was a staircase. Tonight, every stair was slippery. At the registration desk, an assistant replaced the pledge forms again. Irene approached with a tray of coffee cups and asked whether anyone needed a refill. The assistant waved her away. Thomas, standing nearby, took the old stack and slid it into a black portfolio. Irene saw the corner of a form marked with Lila's center name. She also saw a yellow sticky note attached to the stack. Update beneficiary fields, after final pledge. Her stomach tightened. A legitimate charity did not update beneficiaries after a public pledge. She reached to collect an empty cup near the desk and nudged a fallen copy of the sticky note with her shoe. It stuck lightly to the side of her sole. For once, the cheap shoe helped. Irene walked 3 steps away, bent as if adjusting the buckle, and peeled the note free. She tucked it into her palm. Her hands shook, but not enough to spill the tray. Across the room, Beatrice Vane laughed at something Julian said. The stage manager signaled 15 minutes until the final check presentation. The screens would soon show the total. Once the ceremonial transfer was announced, donors would leave, believing their money had gone where the speeches promised. Correcting it afterward would be harder. Julian knew that. He was using the gala itself as a seal. Applause first, paperwork later. Irene needed someone else to see what she saw. She approached the technician near the screen laptop, a young man named Aaron whose badge swung from a lanyard twisted backward. She offered coffee. He accepted with grateful surprise. Irene nodded at the laptop and asked if the pledge slides came from the foundation or the production team. Aaron said the team loaded the foundation file, but a revised version had been sent after dinner started. Irene asked by whom. Aaron stiffened. She did not push. She said that if anyone later asked whether the file changed during the event, he should answer truthfully. He looked at her then, really looked, perhaps recognizing fear in someone else. He whispered that Thomas had brought the revised file on a drive. Julian approved it. Aaron said he did not know what was in it. Irene believed him. Most people in systems like this did not need to know. They only needed to follow the nearest instruction. She thanked him and moved away before Thomas could see them speaking. Now she had a witness, maybe, a frightened one, but still a witness. She had photographs, a program, a draft sheet, a sticky note, and Lila's confirmation. What she did not have was permission to present any of it. Permission, however, was exactly what rooms like this used to protect themselves. She had waited for permission once before and watched truth get buried in procedure. Thomas found her near the dessert station. His expression told her he had been looking. He ordered her to hand over her apron pocket contents. Irene asked on what grounds. He said property had gone missing from registration. Several servers turned to look. Thomas raised his voice enough for them to hear the accusation without calling it one. Irene felt the old pattern forming around her. Question the person, not the facts. Make her defend her character until no one asks about the documents. She removed 2 napkins, a pen, and a service schedule from one pocket. The draft sheet was in the inner fold, pressed flat against her shirt. The sticky note was inside her closed fist. Thomas told her she was done for the night. He said security would escort her to the staff exit, and the catering office would receive a formal complaint. Irene looked toward the stage. The MC was returning to the podium. Julian stood beside the ceremonial check. Lila waited near the stairs, hands clasped in front of her folder. Irene imagined walking out, hearing the ballroom doors close behind her, and spending the rest of the night telling herself she had done what she could. But she had not. Not yet. There was a difference between being stopped and choosing to stop. Irene had spent 3 years confusing the two because it hurt less. Beatrice noticed the confrontation and smiled as if the evening had offered one more entertainment. She called out that perhaps the waitress had finally found something worth more than her shoes. A few guests turned. The comment cut through Irene, but it also gave her an audience. Thomas reached for her elbow. Irene stepped back, not violently, only firmly, and said she needed to speak to the program director. Thomas laughed once. Julian looked over from the stage, and the calm left his face for half a second. That half second told Irene more than any document. He was not annoyed. He was concerned. Concern meant she was close. The MC tapped the microphone. The room settled. He announced that the Harrington Foundation was about to reveal the final total raised for community training, housing access, and workforce opportunity. Cameras adjusted. Donors sat taller. The giant check was lifted by 2 assistants. On the screen, a number began to animate upward, all gleaming digits and celebratory music. Thomas whispered that if Irene took another step, she would never work an event in this city again. Irene looked down at her shoes. The left toe was marked by berry sauce. The leather was cracked. The buckle was dull. They had carried her into offices where she believed truth had weight. They had carried her out of those offices when powerful people decided otherwise. They had carried her through warehouses, hotel kitchens, and banquet halls. They had carried her to this exact line on this exact floor. She thought of her mother's sentence again. If the world looks down, make sure it sees that you still tried. Irene took one breath, then another. She did not feel fearless. Fear was present in every bone. But fear was not a command. It was only information. She stepped around Thomas and walked toward the stage. The clicking heels sounded louder to her than the applause. Maybe no one else heard it. Maybe everyone did. For the first time that night, she did not care. She did not climb onto the stage. She stopped at the first step, close enough for the front tables to see her, close enough for the microphone to catch her voice if the MC lowered it. Julian moved toward her with a smile meant to contain damage. He said there seemed to be a staff issue and asked everyone to enjoy the moment. Irene spoke before Thomas could reach her. She asked the MC to read the legal name of the receiving organization displayed on the screen. The room rustled. Someone laughed. Beatrice said the waitress had opinions now. Julian said the documents had been reviewed. Irene kept her eyes on the MC and repeated the request. The MC looked helplessly at Julian. A donor from the front table, an older woman in a plain black suit, leaned forward and said it was a reasonable question. Money had a destination. The MC read the name on the screen. Harrington Outreach Consulting LLC. Lila's face changed. Irene then held up the printed program and asked him to read the beneficiary listed for the same fund. The MC hesitated. The older donor extended her hand for the program. Irene gave it to her. The donor read aloud, Harrington Community Training Fund. A murmur moved through the ballroom. Julian laughed softly and said the consulting entity was an administrative partner. Lila said, clearly, that her center had authorized no such direct recipient. That was the first crack the room could hear. Irene stepped into it. She explained that donor code HV1042 had appeared under 2 separate pledges before the screen was corrected. She explained that several auction items had shifted from public funds in the printed program to private consulting entities on the screen. She held up the sticky note and read the instruction to update beneficiary fields after final pledge. Thomas tried to interrupt, saying she had taken property. Irene answered that he had replaced pledge forms during the event. Aaron, pale near the laptop, closed his eyes for 1 second, then raised his hand. He confirmed that Thomas delivered a revised file after dinner began, and that Julian approved it. The ballroom changed temperature. No one clapped now. No one laughed freely. The same people who had ignored Irene all night began searching the screens, programs, and forms on their tables. Julian's smile remained, but its edges strained. He said Irene Brooks was a former auditor who had left her profession under questionable circumstances. There it was, the old blade, polished and brought out for company. Several heads turned back toward Irene. Thomas looked relieved. Beatrice smiled again, smaller this time. Julian continued, saying that it was unfortunate when personal resentment expressed itself at a charitable event. He offered to have the matter reviewed privately after the presentation. For a moment, Irene felt the floor tilt just as it had 3 years earlier. The room wanted a reason not to believe a waitress. Julian had given them one. She could feel doubt gathering, polite and eager. She almost defended every line of her history. She almost explained Carl Denton, the report, the missing invoices, the way institutions ruin a person through phrases. Then she realized Julian wanted her trapped in her past. So she told the truth simply. She said she had lost her auditing career because she refused to sign a report that hid the same kind of structure appearing on that screen. She said she had been called difficult then, and she expected to be called difficult now. Her voice shook, but it did not break. She said the issue was not her resume. The issue was whether donors had pledged to one fund while the transfer display named another. The issue was whether forms were changed after signatures. The issue was whether a restricted grant for adult training was being routed through a private consulting company. She asked the donors to pause the transfer until an independent review compared the pledge forms, the program, the screen files, and the receiving account documents. The older woman in the black suit stood. She introduced herself as a retired judge and a donor to the training fund. She requested that no transfer be completed until review. Others followed, some from caution, some from embarrassment, some because cameras were still rolling. Julian tried to regain the podium. He said the foundation welcomed transparency and that administrative complexity should not be mistaken for wrongdoing. But his calm no longer controlled the room. Lila stepped forward and said her center's grant agreement named only Harrington Community Training Fund. Aaron opened the file history on the laptop and projected the revision timestamp. Thomas had submitted the update at 8:26. Julian's initials appeared in the approval field. The ceremonial check, still held by 2 assistants, looked suddenly absurd, a giant symbol waiting for a truth that would not arrive. Beatrice lowered her eyes to the pledge card on her table. Her beneficiary line was blank. For once, she did not speak. Irene did not feel victorious. She felt tired in a way applause could not repair. The room was looking at her now, but recognition and respect were not the same thing. Some guests looked ashamed. Some looked irritated that their beautiful evening had become complicated. Some looked at Julian with anger, not because of the programs, Irene suspected, but because he had made them look foolish in public. That was still useful. Motives did not have to be pure to stop a transfer. The retired judge asked for all documents to be collected by independent counsel. 2 major donors instructed their banks to hold wires. Lila pressed one hand to her folder, as if holding the future in place. Thomas was asked to step away from the registration desk. He looked at Irene as if she had betrayed an order of nature. Julian spoke quietly with 2 board members, but without the microphone his elegance shrank. The gala did not end with shouting or chaos. It ended with people forming clusters, comparing papers, calling lawyers, and avoiding cameras. That was how expensive rooms panicked. Irene returned to the service corridor because no one had told her what else to do. Her tray still waited beside the wall. The berry mark remained on her shoe. She stood there until Lila found her. The program director did not call her brave. She simply said thank you as if the words were a debt and not a performance. Irene nodded, unable to answer at first. Lila asked how Irene had known what to see. Irene said she used to work with non-profit records. Lila seemed to understand there was more, and did not force it open. Behind them, the ballroom continued murmuring. The night of compassion had become a night of accounting. Irene almost smiled at that phrase. Accounting was often treated as small, dull, and bloodless, but sometimes it was the only place where a promise had to reveal whether it had been kept. Thomas passed them with his headset removed, escorted by a board assistant rather than security. He did not look at Irene. Julian remained in the ballroom, surrounded by people who now asked for documents instead of photographs. The catering supervisor found Irene an hour later and told her she could leave. The tone was awkward, balanced between apology and fear of liability. Irene asked whether she would be paid for the full shift. The supervisor said yes, of course, as if that had always been obvious. It had not been obvious. Irene knew how quickly wages became negotiable when workers were inconvenient. She changed clothes in the staff room, folded the borrowed vest, and wiped the berry sauce from her shoe with the same napkin she had used to polish it. The stain faded, but did not disappear completely. She decided to leave it. Some marks were records. Outside, New York had cooled. The service entrance opened onto a side street where delivery trucks idled and smokers from nearby restaurants leaned against brick walls. Irene stepped into the air and expected to feel relief. Instead, she felt exposed. Her phone buzzed with no messages. No one from her old life had suddenly remembered her. No career had been restored in a single night. She still had rent due in 9 days. She still wore the shoes, Beatrice mocked. Yet something inside her had shifted. She had spoken in a room designed to make her silent, and the ceiling had not fallen. Her voice had not fixed everything, but it had interrupted the machinery. In the following days, the Harrington Foundation announced an independent review. The statement was careful, full of phrases like procedural irregularities and temporary suspension of transfers. Julian Marlowe took administrative leave. Thomas Greer no longer appeared on event vendor lists. Reporters called the catering company. One found Irene's number. She ignored the first call, then the second. She did not want to become a headline shaped by strangers. Lila called too, and Irene answered because Lila had never treated her like a symbol. The funds were frozen, Lila said, then redirected to the correct restricted account after emergency board action. Classes would open, perhaps late, but open. A week later, Irene visited the East River Adult Skills Center. It occupied the second floor of a plain brick building above a pharmacy. No chandeliers, no cameras, no Silver Tree logo, just folding tables, donated laptops, bulletin boards, and adults arriving after work with notebooks tucked under their arms. Irene stood in the doorway and watched a woman in a supermarket uniform practice typing a cover letter. A man with paint on his sleeves learned spreadsheet basics from a volunteer. Another student asked how to explain a gap in employment without sounding ashamed. The room contained no glamour, but it contained something the gala had only advertised. It contained effort. Lila introduced Irene to the class only as someone who had helped secure the funding. Irene preferred that. She sat in the back and listened. The instructor spoke about transferable skills. Irene had heard that phrase before, usually from people who did not need to transfer anything themselves. But here, the phrase felt real. A server could understand timing, pressure, memory, and people. A cleaner could understand systems, routines, and what changed when no one watched. A receptionist could understand patterns in human behavior better than executives who never answered their own phones. Value did not disappear because a job title changed. Sometimes it waited quietly until someone needed it. After class, Lila offered Irene a position on the independent audit advisory team the center was forming with several donors. Irene almost refused before Lila finished the sentence. The old fear rose automatically. Files, reports, signatures, men like Julian, rooms where reputation could be bent until it cut. Lila did not push. She said the team needed someone who understood both nonprofit records and what it felt like to be the person those programs claimed to serve. Irene looked at the students packing their bags. She saw tired faces, careful hope, and the stubborn dignity of adults beginning again. She thought of all the doors that had closed when powerful people made her inconvenient. She accepted on one condition. The program had to train and hire people from service backgrounds as compliance assistants, community monitors, and document reviewers. Not as decoration, not as inspirational stories for brochures, as paid professionals. Lila smiled and asked whether Irene had a curriculum in mind. Irene surprised herself by saying yes. The answer came from some untouched room inside her. She would teach them to read names, codes, dates, restrictions, and soft phrases that hid hard decisions. She would teach them that paperwork was not above them. She would teach them that if a promise was written down, someone had the right to check whether it was kept. 1 month after the gala, Irene attended another fundraiser, not as a server, but as an audit advisor. She wore a simple navy dress and carried a folder instead of a tray. The catering staff moved along the walls, and she made a point of meeting their eyes. Her shoes were the same black flats. She had bought a new pair, comfortable and clean, but left them in the box that morning. The old pair had carried her through humiliation, fear, and the moment she chose not to disappear. She did not keep them because she loved suffering. She kept them because they reminded her that dignity was not handed down from a stage. During the reception, a donor asked Irene what made her qualified to review charitable transfers. The question was not unkind, only careless in the way privilege often was careless. Irene looked at the donor, then at the staff moving quietly behind him, and answered without lowering her voice. She said she had been an auditor, then a waitress, and both jobs had taught her how to notice what powerful people missed. The donor had no quick reply. Across the room, Lila smiled. Irene opened her folder. On the first page was a ledger with her name printed clearly at the top. Irene Brooks. No borrowed title, no hidden past, no permission requested. The ballroom around her was smaller than Ashford Grand, but the old sensation still came back. The glitter, the polished language, the easy assumption that goodness could be announced. Irina felt it and let it pass. She no longer believed rooms were honest because they were beautiful. She no longer believed silence was the same as safety. At the audit table, she reviewed each transfer before the public pledge screen went live. Fund names matched. Account numbers matched. Restrictions matched. When one donor assistant apologized for asking too many questions, Irene told her questions were how promises stayed honest. Then she looked down at her shoes, clicked the left heel once against the floor, and began the work again. The first advisory meeting happened in a narrow room above the skills center, not in a hotel ballroom. The table wobbled whenever anyone leaned on it. The coffee came from a machine that groaned before it worked. The projector threw a pale image onto a wall with old tape marks near the ceiling. Irene loved the room immediately. It did not pretend to be noble. It asked people to do the work. Around the table sat Lila, 2 instructors, the retired judge from the gala, a donor representative, and 4 adults from service backgrounds whom Lila had invited at Irene's request. A hotel housekeeper named Marin, a warehouse clerk named Dev, a receptionist named Althea, a banquet server named Paul. They looked cautious, as if they expected the meeting to become another place where people praised their resilience and then made decisions without them. Irene opened the folder in front of her and did not begin with inspiration. She began with a pledge form. She showed them the legal name of a fund, the public name of a campaign, the receiving account, and the line that restricted the money to training costs. Then she showed them a second form with only one word changed, advisory instead of training. Everyone saw it once she pointed. Marin frowned and said it looked harmless until it did not. Irene nodded. That was the lesson. Harm in paperwork rarely arrived wearing a warning sign. It arrived wearing familiar language. It borrowed the face of a good cause. It hid behind people being too busy, too trusting, or too embarrassed to ask simple questions. For the next hour, Irene taught them what she wished someone had taught her younger self with less fear around it. Match the names exactly. Read the footnotes. Circle words that sound soft but move authority. Ask who receives the money, who approves the transfer, who reports the outcome, and who benefits if no one checks. The retired judge listened with folded hands. The donor representative took notes at first with the careful patience of a person humoring a process, then more quickly as the examples became harder to dismiss. Dev raised his hand and said warehouse inventory worked the same way. If a label changed by one letter, a pallet could disappear into the wrong aisle and everyone would blame the night crew. Irene smiled. Systems spoke different dialects, but they lied in similar grammar. By the end of the meeting, the 4 trainees had marked more errors in sample documents than the donor representative had found. Althea caught a date that placed approval before application. Paul noticed a signature page copied onto 2 different agreements. Marin asked why a vendor described as independent shared an address with the foundation's event contractor. Irene felt something in her chest loosen. This was not charity. This was competence being invited into the room from the hallway. It was what the gala had claimed to support but had never imagined trusting. When the meeting ended, Lila asked the trainees whether they wanted to continue. They did not answer with speeches. They asked what the next assignment was. News about the gala moved through the city in the strange, polished way public embarrassment travels among wealthy people. The newspapers did not call it fraud at first. They called it a governance concern, then a transfer controversy, then a restricted fund review. Julian's photograph appeared beside phrases carefully chosen by lawyers. He expressed confidence in the process. He welcomed clarity. He was proud of the Foundation's mission. Irene read none of the articles all the way through. She had learned that public language often tried to sand the edges off private wrongdoing. What mattered was not whether Julian sounded calm in print. What mattered was that the money had not left the correct path. Beatrice Vane sent a note 2 weeks later. It arrived through the catering office, folded inside an expensive cream envelope with Irene's name written in blue ink. Irene almost threw it away. Instead, she opened it at her kitchen table. Beatrice did not apologize for the shoes directly. People like Beatrice often found straight lines uncomfortable. She wrote that the evening had been difficult for everyone, and that Irene's observations had prevented confusion. Irene laughed once, softly. Confusion. That was a velvet word placed over a broken hinge. At the bottom of the note, Beatrice included a personal check to the Skills Center and a separate card from a shoe boutique. Irene looked at the card for a long time, then placed it back in the envelope. The next morning, she returned the boutique card with a short reply. She thanked Beatrice for supporting the center and suggested that the next gala budget include proper footwear stipends for every service worker scheduled to stand more than 4 hours. No one needed a donor's pity gift after being mocked, she wrote. They needed working conditions that did not depend on pity. She did not know whether Beatrice would understand. Understanding was not the price of Irene's dignity. Still, 3 days later, Lila forwarded a revised vendor policy from one of Beatrice's companies. It included footwear allowances for event staff. Irene read the line twice. It was small. It was not absolution. But small policies could change the pain in someone's feet, and Irene had learned to respect practical victories. Carl Denton also resurfaced. His message arrived by email with a subject line that made Irene's stomach tighten before she opened it. Long time. Time. He wrote that he had seen coverage of the Harrington Review and hoped she was well. He said the past had been complicated. He said perhaps everyone had been under pressure then. He did not say he was sorry. Irene stared at the email for several minutes, feeling the old room assemble itself around her. The conference table. The report. Carl's pen near the signature line. The way he had looked disappointed in her for refusing to help him make a falsehood convenient. She typed 3 different replies and deleted all of them. Finally, she wrote one sentence. Pressure explains choices. It does not erase them. She did not send it immediately. She made tea, washed a plate, sat by the window, and read the sentence again. It was not dramatic enough to satisfy the part of her that wanted Carl to feel what she had felt. It was not warm enough to protect him from discomfort. It was simply true. She sent it. For the first time in years, his name did not take the air from the room. That, too, was a kind of recovery. The independent review eventually confirmed what Irene had seen from the ballroom wall. Several pledged amounts had been prepared for transfer through entities with names similar to restricted funds. Documentation had been changed during the event. Oversight processes had been bypassed in the name of efficiency. Julian resigned before the final report was released, saying he did not want to distract from the Foundation's mission. Irene recognized the phrase as one last attempt to stand near virtue while leaving through a side door. The report did not restore the years she had lost. It did not pay back the rent she had struggled to meet, or the confidence she had buried. But it placed a public record where rumor used to stand, and public records mattered. At the Skills Center, Irene's training group grew. The first 4 trainees became 8, then 12. They practiced reading grant agreements, vendor invoices, pledge sheets, and program reports. They learned to ask questions without apologizing first. They learned that being polite did not require being vague. They learned that a person could be respectful and still insist that a number match. Irene watched them discover the strange power of exactness. For people who had spent years being described with loose words like help, staff, labor, or support, exactness felt almost luxurious. A correct name, a correct amount, a correct destination, a correct credit. The world had denied them many things, but it did not get to deny what was written on the page. One evening, Paul stayed after class and admitted he had always thought paperwork belonged to people who spoke differently than he did. Irene asked what he meant. He looked embarrassed and said people with smoother voices, better suits, degrees displayed in frames. Irene slid a pledge sheet toward him and asked him to find the receiving account. He found it in 3 seconds. Then she handed him a vendor agreement and asked who could approve a fee change. He found that too. She told him the page did not care about his accent, his suit, or his history. The page cared whether he was willing to read it carefully. Paul sat back, smiling in a small, startled way. That smile meant more to Irene than any applause at the gala. The next fundraiser Irene supervised was smaller and stricter. Before the doors opened, she gathered the service staff in the hallway. They expected rules about trays and timing. Instead, Irene told them where the staff meal was, where they could sit during breaks, which manager had authority to answer payroll questions, and whom they could contact if a guest crossed a line. She gave each worker a card with the event's labor standards and the name of the fund receiving the donations. One young server looked surprised and asked why they needed to know the fund name. Irene looked at the trays, the polished shoes, the tired faces, and answered that everyone in the room deserved to know what story they were helping tell. During that fundraiser, no donor mocked a waitress's shoes within Irene's hearing. Perhaps people had become kinder. More likely, word had traveled that service staff were no longer guaranteed to stay silent. Irene accepted either reason. Change did not always begin as virtue. Sometimes it began as caution and matured later into respect. At 9 o'clock, the pledge screen went live after Irene and 2 trainees checked each field. The legal names matched. The donor codes advanced in order. The account numbers aligned with the restricted fund documents. When the first applause came, Irene listened without bitterness. Applause was not the problem. Applause only became dangerous when it tried to replace accountability. After the event, Irene walked home instead of taking the bus. The city was bright, with restaurants, traffic, and windows that reflected other people's celebrations. Her old shoes clicked against the pavement, still imperfect, still hers. She thought about the first night at Ashford Grand, the laughter at table 6, Julian's smooth warning, Thomas's hand reaching for her elbow, and the moment she chose to step forward. She had once believed that dignity meant never letting anyone see your need. Now she understood it differently. Dignity was not the absence of need. Dignity was refusing to let need make a liar of you. When she reached her building, Irene paused before going inside. From her bag, she removed the old name tag from the catering shift. Irene. No last name. No title. No history. She had kept it without knowing why. Now she took a pen and wrote Brooks beneath the printed letters. The ink smudged slightly on the plastic surface, but it held. She placed the name tag on her kitchen shelf beside her audit folder. It was not a trophy. It was a witness. A reminder that the woman in cheap shoes had not been rescued by the powerful. She had rescued a promise from them, using the very mind they had assumed she did not have. Months later, the Skills Center printed its first internal audit handbook. Irene refused to put her photograph on the cover. She chose a plain design with a ledger line, a pencil, and the title, Reading the Promise. Inside, the first page held one sentence. A fund is not generous until it arrives where it was promised. The handbook explained donor codes, restricted grants, vendor reviews, reimbursement trails, and conflict disclosures in language anyone could use. It was not simplified because the readers were less capable. It was clarified because complicated language had protected careless people for too long. Copies went first to the trainees, then to partner nonprofits, then to adult education centers in other cities. Irene began receiving emails from people she had never met. A kitchen supervisor in Queens found a billing error in a food training grant. A night receptionist in Newark questioned a vendor address and helped prevent a duplicate payment. A former warehouse worker in Philadelphia wrote that he had always thought oversight belonged to people above him, until the handbook made him realize careful eyes were a skill, not a social class. Irene printed that email and taped it inside her cabinet door. When Harrington invited her to speak at a governance workshop, she agreed only if service staff, program staff, and students sat beside donors. On the agenda, she wrote 2 words that made every promise answerable: prove it. She ended the session by asking each person to write down one promise they had once been told was too complicated for them to question. Then she asked them to underline the part that could be verified. The room grew quiet, then busy with pens. Irene listened to the sound and knew the work had finally moved beyond her at last.